Welcome to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now, a weekly podcast diving into one issue affecting Israel and the Jewish world right now. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our editor, David Horovitz. Hi, David. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, Amanda.
We are together for several reasons, but also to mark 5 years to our daily briefing, daily podcast. It's become daily since October 7th, 2023. And we started it 5 years ago at David's request, actually.
And you're telling me that we only started doing it daily, or most especially you started doing it daily only since October the 7th, 2023, since that most terrible of days?
That's right. Prior to the massacre of 1,200 and the hostage-taking of 250 to Gaza, we had been doing the daily briefing 5 days a week, Sunday through Thursday. And since October 7th was on a Saturday, we began that Saturday with you, actually, and our military reporter, Emmanuel Fabian, and have continued every day since. So, David, do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, let's talk about this. First of all, I'm staggered by the fact that, we have the site has such extremely high levels of traffic, especially since October the 7th. The numbers are, we had 150 million page views in October 2023, which you would think that's just a wonderful thing, except it's a reflection of how terrible the situation was in Israel, and our traffic has stayed incredibly high. Nonetheless, in every interaction I have with people, almost all of whom read the Times of Israel, they mention the podcast and they talk about the podcast and they love the podcast, and it's just because they feel a proximity to us and what we're doing. And I don't think you can fake stuff in a podcast when you're on all the time and people are speaking from the heart, and that immediacy, I think, conveys to readers/listeners. Is that your sense too, that the feedback is incredibly supportive and appreciative in a way that's quite unique, I think, to the things that we do at the site?
So I live in a very Hebrew language world. I live in a very Israeli atmosphere. And so I don't actually know anyone who listens to the podcast aside from my father. And he is slightly not objective, but he gives me feedback. But I am really blessed in that our listeners write in quite a lot. And after they got over the initial shock of my terrible American/Canadian/who knows what accent, people are extremely supportive and grateful, I think, and that makes me really have the strength to carry on.
And why do you think it's so resonant? Because of that, no holds barred. You ask a question, we do our best to answer it. I know my colleagues prepare pretty thoroughly and want to be informed and want to make sure they're given expertise and added value. I'm sure that's part of the appeal.
I think also the appeal is that, the very reason why you created the Times of Israel, because we fill a niche that is so lacking in Israeli news coverage, but definitely in international news coverage. And this is something we're going to speak about later in the podcast. But I think it's just so difficult for people to find that trusted, balanced, as objective as possible voice coming out of Israel or out of anywhere, seriously, right now. So one of the things that I've found interesting in looking at the analytics, David, you might find this of interest as well, is that really we're listened to throughout the globe. Of course, our main listenership is the United States, but if you look at where people are listening, it's even places that you wouldn't expect anyone would care what's happening to Israel, such as Iran, for example.
How are people able to listen to this in Iran? How do you know they're listening to us in Iran?
Well, I'm not any kind of tech guru, but our analytics shows different places in the world where people are listening. And of course, our listenership is very low in Saudi Arabia or in the United Arab Emirates, but they're still listening there. Unless the VPN is putting their IPO number into these countries in particular. I don't know. But I find that interesting. And recently I sent you a really great letter that we had from an Iranian listener who listened to one of the episodes I'd done with Haviv Retegur, our senior analyst. And he was just so supportive of getting the Israeli perspective on what's happening in Iran. And of course, I don't know if our listeners even know this, but the Times of Israel has a Farsi edition.
Right. And there too, we assume that, we know, we can see where people are ostensibly reading material. That's a Google Analytics, tool, and there are other tools. We assume that there are people in Iran who are reading the Farsi site who do not show up on analytics as being in Iran because they're using VPNs to gain access to a site that I think, broadly speaking, the Iranians regime would be doing its best to prevent Iranians from accessing. We know that it is read in Iran, in part because Iranian media, state media, has been known to quote from the Times of Israel in English, I'm sure from its English sources and from its Farsi sources. So yeah, it's pretty amazing, the reach and the fact that people everywhere want to know what's going on here and want what I would like to think they have come to realize is a website and podcasts and a team who are trying to understand what's going on, get to the truth, report it fairly, and so on.
So let's talk about that. And recently, there's been a lot of buzz around the freedom of the press. There's, of course, the government press office that said that it will no longer take ads or place ads in Haaretz. I'm not really clear on this saga. David, do you remember what went on there?
Well, the publisher of Haaretz spoke about Hamas in the context of freedom fighters. It's more complicated, and the language is more nuanced than that. But it was a speech that Haaretz's own editor had issues with. This government, which is hostile to independent, critical media, saw an opportunity and announced that state advertising, government advertising, ministerial advertising, which I believe was quite widely distributed, certainly across print publications. They decided they would not place any more state advertising in the pages of Haaretz, which, of course, economically is a blow to the newspaper. I think that's one element of a much wider open government campaign against critical media. Israel has a state broadcaster called Kan, which underwent a quote-unquote reform in recent years. It was, I think, the goal of the government really was to bring it to its knees. It was quite independent and often critical of the government. And in fact, Kan emerged still alive and kicking and does a great deal of original programming, leaving news aside. It's a huge part of the media industry. Some wonderful programming. For example, the series Tehran is a Kan production. There's lots of original programming, and now there's really an effort to sell off Kan, which it's not clear that a buyer would be found, and if no buyer is found, it might be closed down. So it's a news outlet that is critical of the government and has a great deal of original work and employs a great deal of people. It'll be a major blow to the Israeli entertainment industry. It's also set its sights on Army radio. In both cases, you have to say, wait a minute, well, the state has a broadcaster, but it's not kowtowing to the state. Well, that's very healthy. The army has a broadcaster that's not kowtowing to the state. It's a very unusual set of contexts that we're describing here. But yeah, the army radio is certainly not uniformly hostile to the government. It has many, many anchors and programs featuring material and content that is pretty empathetic, to put it mildly, to the government, but it's a mix, and it's not something that the government controls, and therefore the communications minister is openly targeting both Kan, the state broadcaster, and Army radio. And generally, there's legislation that's gone through, and there are actions that have been taken, for example, to ban Al Jazeera in Israel. Now, Al Jazeera, I think it can be quite credibly argued, has incited violence, has attempted to incite violence with some of its coverage, both against Israel from the outside and within Israel. But the concern is that once you have that kind of legislation, and once you are ready to use it, and once you are the arbiters with resorts to the court and so on, of what is problematic, unacceptable, bannable coverage, that's pretty dangerous. For free media, there's a great deal of hostility to journalists being whipped up by loyalists of this government in all kinds of circumstances, including when journalists are going about their work reporting on terrorist attacks or missiles falling and so on. The atmosphere in which journalists are working, I would say, is definitely becoming more fraught, has become more fraught in recent years. So there's a combination of potential legislation, an atmosphere that is being created, and some steps that have been taken that make the absolute freedom of the press in Israel something that is in the shadows, shall we say, at the moment. Definitely, under some degree of threat.
What's interesting, I think, is if you look around at the politicians in the Knesset, so many of them were journalists, or at least a TV personality / journalist, which in Israel can definitely happen. Yair Lapid, for example, and many others in that wing of the government, meaning the opposition. I don't know of anyone in the coalition who was a journalist. Do you remember?
I mean, start with Boaz Bismuth, who was the editor of a very pro-Netanyahu newspaper, Yisrael Hayom, and is now a very articulate and prominent supporter of Netanyahu as an MK in the Likud party. And he's not the only one.
Oh, for sure. Okay, so really good point. And many of these journalists actually made their way up through Army radio, which is also semi-ironic.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And the fact is that, of course, the government is irked with the fact that they don't have control over these bodies because so much of the budget from the government goes towards them. Isn't that the key issue here?
If I thought that it was a budgetary issue and that this was motivated by a government scrupulous in its economic responsibility and determined to make sure that funds are allocated to the most needy, focusing everything, for example, on reconstruction from the war and communities that were, tens of thousands of people. You have to go up north to understand the extent of the damage, rather than a government that was assiduously allocating vast sums of money to the special narrow interests of particular elements of the coalition, then I might be a little more sympathetic to the notion that this was all being done for economic motives. I do not think for a second that that is the case.
Okay, let's talk about another issue that I think is very difficult for people who don't live here to understand. And we've touched on it several times, but every time we touch on it, I get more and more questions. And that's the issue of the military censorship. And as I understand it, here at the Times of Israel, we abide by it, but we can have pushback. If the censor takes out certain passages, we can have a conversation with the censor and negotiate. But who uses the censor most of all? Our military reporter, Emmanuel Fabian. Would you say every piece he publishes or every more in-depth piece he publishes goes through the censor?
The way it works, basically, it's based on what you'd call, in the old days, a gentleman's agreement. I don't know how you would refer to that more politically correctly nowadays, but it works on the basis that traditional media, at the very least, has a legal obligation to heed concerns and not publish material that is prejudicial to national security at the most concrete level. So, for example, when a soldier is killed, it might be quite widely known, but it won't be reported until the family has been notified. The name won't be given, at least until it is certain that the people most affected are aware of what has happened. Nobody's going to start specifying that Israel has deployed X number of soldiers to a certain place in a war zone or on a frontier and so on. That's the basis of the understanding by which military censorship works. In theory, it may well be that there is a requirement to submit much more material to the censor for prior approval than media generally does because of the practicalities of that. But when it's clear that there's material that potentially would harm national security to a concrete level, there's an obligation to check it with the censor first. So, for example, you mentioned Manny, our military reporter. If he goes into Gaza, and he goes into Gaza with the IDF, I'm sure it is made overt that, hey, you have to submit this to censorship, and there may be things that people tell you, because they speak freely when you're with them, that it's dangerous for us to publish, and therefore please submit the material to us, and we do. There are other occasions where we publish something, and the censor subsequently contacts us and says, can you please take this down? There is lots of pushback. So there's the potential for pushback in real time with the censor. which is an office with shifts and people heading shifts and a hierarchy, of course. So, for example, I think I've mentioned this before, when Hezbollah fired a drone that landed and exploded at Netanyahu's home in Caesarea and smashed a window. Didn't smash through the window, but cracked the window. And there was a picture, and everyone knew about it, and it was reported everywhere except by Israeli media, including the Times of Israel. And I called the censor, actually, and I said, this is ridiculous. You're making all of Israeli media look stupid. Everybody knows exactly what's happened. It's been reported in newspapers and on television around the world. And I was told, I don't think I'm breaking censorship in telling you this. Well, that's the decision of the censor, because Israeli media, like the Times of Israel, are so credible that when our enemies read stuff in other publications, they don't care. But if it's in the Times of Israel or other Israeli media, and in fact, because you're in English, it's even more significant, they take it seriously. And we don't want to give information to the enemy. Now, the notion that Hezbollah has the technological skills to fire a drone and detonate it in the prime minister's backyard, but didn't have a little camera in there showing exactly where it's going and knowing what happened. I mean, I think technologically, that does not make sense, never mind in any kind of interpretive way. The fact is, Hezbollah must have known exactly what it had done with the drone that it fired with such accuracy. But, that's an argument that we lost. I could defy the censor and I suppose there's potential punishment. There's no real point. A few days later, we were indeed allowed to confirm, all Hebrew media, all Israeli media was allowed to confirm what other people had been reporting. There are ways that people go around the censor. There are incidents all the time in this war where material has been leaked, and there's, of course, a whole scandal around the leaking of some material, but where material is leaked to international media to evade the censor. I think there are nudges and winks about material that is leaked to avoid censorship. It's different when it comes out in an international publication, etc. It's really complicated, but the bottom line is that it works because there's a readiness on the whole to accept that there's some validity to efforts by the censor to prevent you publishing stuff. There is, of course, ultimately a court process. There's the potential for an outlet or outlets to appeal to the court and say the censor is acting in a way that is not logically acceptable, not reasonable, and the courts have intervened, have been known to intervene. So as a last resort, if you feel you're being prevented from publishing something that ought to be published and that the reasons being advanced for you not to publish it do not hold up, you go to the courts, which takes us, by the way, again, and we don't need to go there now, into the vast concerns that I feel and many Israelis feel about efforts to constrict and take away, really, the independence of the courts. This is just one, I would say, even relatively minor aspect of emphasizing why you need an efficient and genuinely independent judicial hierarchy in Israel, and that too is under threat.
What is always interesting to me about the censor, and this is how I've had more interactions with it, is that it's also for the protection of Jewish populations under threat. So, for example, any story about Jews of Yemen or even Morocco or other places that Jews could potentially be under threat has to go through the censor, which is why I was really surprised this week to see a story, I think it was from AP, about Syrian Jews, the very last remnants of Syrian Jews. And I definitely raised an eyebrow and thought, I wonder if they actually put this through the censor, but they're not actually obligated to, right, David?
By what means could an Israeli government and an Israeli military hierarchy prevent the Associated Press in Syria from publishing an article? And there are no such means. So not that they're not obligated, that's just not a thing. It's not possible. There were many things that were pretty interesting about that story, indeed, out of Syria. One of the ironically, I don't know how to describe it, amusing aspects was that the news agency report, which went to the synagogue in Damascus, described the synagogue as, in the text of the article, as partially destroyed, and it had accompanying photographs. If that is a partially destroyed building, I hesitate to think what a totally destroyed building looks like, because there were some walls that you could see, no roof, and nothing. There was nothing left of that building except for the ruined shell. and mention of the last 9 Jews of Syria, which is indeed something we don't hear a great deal about. The member of the community who spoke to AP was interviewed on Cannes, on the state broadcaster, a day later. It's indeed a very interesting story. Who knew that there were maybe 9 Jews in Syria? And in the case of at least that person, he chose not to leave. I'm sure he could have left, and he chose not to leave for reasons including, I suppose, wanting to help preserve what could be preserved of a rich Jewish history in Syria.
So obviously the censor is not the watchdog for international media, and neither are we. And one of the letters that I often receive from our listeners is requests for clarification on, for example, New York Times articles. And one listener even suggested that we do a weekly column fact-checking and rebutting the New York Times. Do you see this as part of your job?
I see the essence of a huge part of our job is trying to find out what is going on and report it fairly. I would want to hope that that's what all decent journalists and decent journalistic outlets are trying to do. I have reached, and we have reached many, many times, especially in the last 14 and a half months, very different conclusions about what is going on, most especially, but not only, in Gaza, than much better resourced media outlets than ours. I can't quite understand how that can be. If you are, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and the BBC, and you've got immense resources, I fail to understand why, after all this time, you are taking, not always at face value, but often at something close to face value, claims about events being disseminated by Hamas, when not only is Hamas openly committed to destroying Israel and has invaded sovereign Israel and massacred over 1,000 people, most of them civilians, and continues to hold hostages. Leaving that aside, it has demonstrably lied time after time about what has unfolded in Gaza since. There are different takes, there are different assessments, there are different ways of looking at things. But in terms of the hard facts about what has happened, it is demonstrably the case that Hamas has continued to lie. Israel didn't blow up Al-Ahli Hospital on October the 17th. So that was 10 days into the war. That was an early sign that if you had taken Hamas's claims that Israel had killed hundreds of people in an air raid or a missile attack on a hospital 10 days into the war, and that was not the case, and you know that that was not the case, why would you, all these months afterwards, continue to highlight those kinds of claims? Now, it's really complicated getting to the truth of these things. 5 journalists were killed in Gaza by Israel just the other day, while Israel says they were working for Islamic Jihad. So were they journalists for Islamic Jihad? If you're the journalist active on behalf of a terrorist organization, what are you first, a terrorist or a journalist? I mean, these are, I have my own opinions, obviously, but it's complicated. But what happened? Certainly there are 2 sides to that story. Did you show both sides of that story? Did you make the effort? By the way, you might be happy by the fact that Israel doesn't always respond in relatively real time to allegations made by Hamas and other terrorist organizations, but you'd think you'd want to try. What has been going on in very northern Gaza in the last few days surrounding a hospital there, the Kamal Adwan hospital, the allegation that Israel has killed dozens of innocent people being disseminated by Hamas, the Israeli assertion 2 days ago that in fact something like, if my numbers are accurate, 20 or some slightly more, slightly less, a number of terrorists, alleged terrorists, were killed. The army says it is unaware of any civilian casualties in that operation around a hospital where the Israeli army says Hamas had basically based itself, confident that the Israeli army wasn't going to come in. It's very, very hard to get to the truth of that. But reasonable journalism, you would think, would require a very, very serious effort to at least understand what both the sides in this war are saying. And yet you don't see that scrupulous effort being made in every circumstance by any means. So that's my very long and earnest and impassioned answer to your question. And the shorter answer is, I don't see, our priority is trying to report what is happening as accurately as we can. We are not a media watchdog. There are other organizations that do that with greater and less nuance and skill and credibility. We're a journalistic outlet. We try to do our journalism. We do, when we see material being reported that we know is not true, and that matters, and that it matters to make it clear that it's not true, we do sometimes publish material that says, contrary to reports A, B, and C, when we're sure that what we are debunking or correcting, that we are on solid ground. But our prime goal is to get it right ourselves.
But we have huge blindsides, of course. We don't have a reporter in Gaza. When we go into Gaza, we're accompanied by the IDF. And then, of course, the material has to go through the censorship, as we've just discussed. We don't have a reporter reporting from Hezbollah territory in Lebanon or Syria territory. So how do you get around that?
Look, Amanda, that question goes to the heart of everything that we've been discussing already. Nor, of course, does the New York Times or the BBC or the Guardian or the Washington Post or other outlets. They do not have independent, full-time staff people who they are confident are able to work under conditions that would allow them to report fairly. All the news agencies, all of those outlets, as far as I'm aware, if I'm wrong, somebody should tell me, rely on Gaza-based journalists, some of whom may be the most scrupulous and independent-minded people, and some of whom may put their lives at great risk to try to report fairly, but all of whom are working under the pressure of a war with a still relatively robust Hamas that is ruthless in dealing with its critics, its internal critics in Gaza. This is a very, very difficult area in which to operate. And therefore, yes, of course, we, like everybody else, have the greatest of trouble in trying to get to the truth. That's the whole issue here. Everything that we have seen, that a staff member, of the Times of Israel has seen, we can be relatively confident because A, B, or C person actually saw that happening. Other than that, you are trying to get to the truth in incredibly difficult circumstances. Of course, that's the root of the problem.
We have another, I don't know if I would call it a threat, but another challenge on the horizon, and that is AI, artificial intelligence. And we as an operation, we've talked about it a little bit. We're not currently using it. But as you see other operations, including the New York Times, starting to use AI in their actual articles, in their actual writing of the articles, what are your thoughts right now, David?
Yeah, I just think that a great deal of wariness needs to be employed when it comes to disseminating material that you didn't author and whose precise source is not always clear and whose credibility is not always clear. I mean, in a way, it's a continuation of the last subject that we were talking about. Ultimately, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but if you've got a phenomenon where material is synthesized and ostensibly weight of evidence would produce accounts that are purportedly accurate and credible, you're going to create a situation in which media, being largely a for-profit or certainly a business enterprise, will want to reduce the amount of money it spends on original material because, hey, there's all this material out there. There are these tools that will ensure that the account that we would be disseminating, even if we didn't write it, would be credible. That seems to me to be, there's a fundamental illogic in that process, because if there is less and less original material being put into that AI mixer, if you like, what are you going to be left with? You're going to be left with a narrowing flow of original, credible material mixed into I don't know what online. And I think that's not the way journalism or truth are best served. We're smart people. We have intellect, we have context, we have curiosity. Presumably, if we're doing journalism, we have writing skills, organizational skills, a capacity to put our own thoughts to the side for a moment and hear what other people are saying and bear accurate witness to what we are seeing. I'm not sure any of that sits well with some kind of incredibly sophisticated and, I'm sure, process that has potential positive applications of all kinds. I'm not sure how well that works for journalism. I wait to see, and we're wary, and I think responsible media should be pretty wary about where this might lead, an over-reliance on AI and a reduced reliance on original material by people that you have trained, that you have worked with, and that you can trust.
I would like to take this moment to thank two other humans who are integral parts of the Daily Briefing. And that is, of course, my partner in crime, Jessica Steinberg, and our producer, Gilad Bronstein, who does the Podwaves company. So, David, thank you for joining me today on What Matters Now.
I just want to say thank you, Amanda, because I know how much time and effort and love you put into this, and you built something that didn't exist before, and you turned it into something that is essential for large numbers of people. And as somebody who gets questioned by you on this on average of at least once a week, I appreciate the fact that you ask me stuff all the time that I would not have expected you to ask me. And I think that's an incredible positive to have somebody who's coming at this from, your angle, your original and unconstrained angle, because you're curious about something and you want to ask. I think it's fantastic. I think it's one of the reasons why this is such a success, your curiosity and your manifest integrity as you do this.
David, thanks so much. Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.